It was a quiet evening in Atlanta, Georgia. Chuck Garrison, a successful real estate mogul with a flourishing career, sat back in his leather chair, enjoying the life he had meticulously built: a new wife, a growing fortune, and the admiration of his peers. But there was one thing Chuck had been living with that no one knew. His first wife, Denise, had been brutally murdered 8 years ago. At least that's what he thought. Chuck had buried her, convinced that he had finally freed himself of the past. But that night, as the clock struck 9 p.m., the silence in his house was shattered by a knock at the door. The knock was deliberate, unsettling. Who could be calling at this hour? When Chuck opened it, the last person he expected to see stood before him: Denise, alive, standing on his porch. After all this time, after everything Chuck had done, how could she be alive? And what did she want now? Stay tuned, because the truth will leave you speechless. Chuck Garrison had it all: wealth, status, and a reputation as a well-established real estate developer. He was the man everyone admired for his charm and success. His colleagues praised him, his friends envied him, and his new wife stood proudly beside him as they shared a life built on appearances. On the surface, everything about Chuck's life seemed perfect, a fairy tale of success and prosperity. But the story behind the facade was far darker. Behind closed doors, Chuck's marriage to Denise, his first wife, was crumbling. While Chuck thrived in his career, Denise, who had once believed in the promise of their perfect family, found herself sinking into a world of betrayal and deception. Chuck's infidelity was no secret. Hotel receipts that weren't hers, lipstick stains on his shirts, and late nights at the office were just the start. Denise, who had once trusted her husband, began to realize that Chuck was living a double life. Each time she confronted him, Chuck was quick to apologize, promising to change, but his words were empty. Weeks of good behavior followed by more deceit only deepened the growing rift between them. Denise, a woman who had supported Chuck through his early struggles, now found herself trapped in a marriage where trust was gone and love was a distant memory. The man she had once believed in had become a stranger, one who seemed more interested in his success than in his wife. As Chuck's career soared, his obsession with wealth grew. But his financial empire was built on risky investments and reckless spending. Behind the scenes, Chuck was bleeding money. The extravagant lifestyle he had become accustomed to was quickly becoming unsustainable. When Denise discovered that Chuck had secretly taken out a second mortgage on their home, it was the final straw. She had always suspected that Chuck's finances were in disarray, but seeing the evidence confirmed her worst fears. Denise confronted him, demanding answers about their financial situation. But instead of owning up to his mistakes, Chuck, ever the manipulator, turned the tables. He blamed her for their troubles, accusing her of not understanding the pressure he was under. "I've tried," Chuck said, his voice filled with frustration. "But you'll leave me with nothing." It was in that moment that Denise made the hardest decision of her life. She had endured enough. She threatened to leave, to take control of her life and start over. She would file for divorce, and there was nothing Chuck could do to stop her. But Chuck, in his arrogance and entitlement, couldn't accept the idea of losing everything he had worked for. He had built his empire, but to him, Denise was nothing more than an obstacle. For Chuck, the idea of Denise leaving with half of what he had worked so hard to build was unthinkable. The man who had lived for control now saw his world slipping away. His perfect life, his perfect image was at risk. He knew that if Denise left, it would destroy the facade he had carefully constructed. So in his mind, there was only one solution. He had to make her disappear. Chuck's decision was calculated and cold. He couldn't allow Denise to leave with half of what he owned, to tear apart the life he had worked so hard to build. His arrogance led him to believe that he could get away with anything, that he could silence her once and for all. It was the beginning of a dark and irreversible path, a path that would lead to Denise's ultimate betrayal and Chuck's downfall. In Chuck's mind, Denise was no longer the loving wife he had promised a future to. She had become his enemy, an obstacle to his success. And now, as the cracks in their marriage widened, Chuck made the most chilling decision of all. He decided that it was time for Denise to disappear. Forever. It was supposed to be a trip to save their marriage, or so Chuck told himself. He had suggested a vacation to Cancun, hoping that the change of scenery, the beach, and the promise of time away from the pressures of their everyday life would reignite the spark they had lost. But Chuck had a very different plan in mind, a plan that would rid him of Denise once and for all, permanently. Upon arrival, the first few days seemed almost normal. They walked hand in hand along the beach, had romantic dinners under the stars, and even shared a few laughs. It felt like the old days, like a brief moment of the happiness they had once shared. For Chuck, it was the perfect setup. He thought he could convince Denise that everything was fine, that their relationship was worth saving. But for Denise, the tension was mounting. She had been on edge since the moment she agreed to the trip. She had hoped that the distance would help. But it only made things worse. The lies, the betrayals, the mounting debts. Chuck's manipulations were starting to weigh heavily on her. The more she uncovered about Chuck's financial secrets, the more she realized that their marriage was beyond saving. She had tried to convince herself that they could work through their issues, but now it was clear that there was nothing left to fix. The man she had married was no longer someone she could trust. One evening, after another heated argument over their finances, Denise reached her breaking point. Chuck had been dismissive, defensive, and as always, blaming her for their problems. His arrogance had no bounds, and Denise couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done, Chuck," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "I'm filing for divorce when we get home." Chuck's face, which had been twisted in frustration, suddenly turned cold. The reality of what Denise had just said hit him hard. For the first time in their marriage, Chuck was truly afraid of losing everything he had built. His empire, his money, his control. All of it could come crashing down if Denise followed through on her threat. Denise stood there, her eyes filled with defiance. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She had made her decision. She turned and walked away from him, leaving Chuck to process the weight of her words. In that moment, a rush of panic surged through him. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let her take half of everything. His perfect life, the life he had so carefully crafted, was about to unravel. That night, as the darkness of the Cancun sky settled in, Chuck found himself alone in their room, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He knew he had to act fast before Denise could take any more steps toward leaving him. In a desperate attempt to maintain control over the situation, he made a decision that would change everything. In a blur of rage and fear, Chuck grabbed the .38 revolver he had concealed in his luggage. The weapon was cold in his hands, as he turned toward Denise, who was sitting on the bed, her back to him. She didn't even see it coming. The first bullet hit her in the shoulder. Denise gasped in shock, her body jerking as the pain tore through her. Before she could react, Chuck fired again. The second bullet struck her in the stomach, and she collapsed onto the floor, struggling for air, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Chuck stood frozen for a moment, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. But there was no time to think. Denise, despite the brutal attack, was still alive, still moving. Chuck watched in horror as she tried to crawl towards him, her body racked with pain, her hands reaching out as if begging him to stop. His heart raced as he saw her twitching, her life hanging by a thread. He had to finish it. There could be no witnesses, no survivors. The last thing Chuck wanted was to leave any evidence of his crime. In a blur of fear and panic, he grabbed Denise's limp body and dragged her outside, into the dense jungle that surrounded their vacation home. The moonlight illuminated the scene, casting an eerie glow over the landscape as Chuck desperately dug a shallow grave. The sound of the shovel scraping against the earth was the only noise in the still night air. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he worked quickly, urgently. The grave was hastily dug, the soil soft under his shovel. With Denise's body still twitching, Chuck shoved her into the grave. He watched as her body lay there, cold and motionless, her face pale and her eyes open in a final plea. But Chuck didn't care. He quickly covered her with dirt, burying her in the dark, cold earth. He stood over the grave, panting, his heart still pounding. Denise was gone, buried beneath the soil, and with her, the last of Chuck's worries. He thought he had done it. He had rid himself of his problem. No one would ever know. Chuck walked away, convinced that he had buried his past, his secrets, and the woman who could ruin everything. As he returned to the house, Chuck wiped his hands on his pants, trying to erase the evidence of his crime. He disposed of the gun, cleaned the bloodstains, and prepared his alibi. By the time the morning came, it would all be over. No one would ever find out what had happened. Or so he thought. Chuck returned to the United States, playing the role of the grieving husband to perfection. He reported Denise as missing, painting a picture of her as another tragic case of a woman who had vanished without a trace. The authorities, as expected, didn't take much interest. People go missing all the time, they told him. His act was flawless. His story fit the narrative, and soon the search for Denise was called off. Chuck was showered with sympathy, and life moved on without a hitch. He remarried quickly, his new wife none the wiser to his past. His business continued to flourish, and Chuck built his new life on the foundation of a lie. His days were filled with meetings, social events, and the ongoing illusion of success. His past, the one that included Denise, was buried deep beneath the surface, locked away and forgotten. But Chuck had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated Denise. When Denise finally regained consciousness, her world was unrecognizable. Everything felt foreign. The sterile white walls of the hospital room, the unfamiliar faces of the doctors and nurses, the language she couldn't understand. She was alive, but everything else seemed distant, like a fog she couldn't clear. For over a year, she had been fighting for her life in a small hospital in Mexico, unable to remember anything from her past. She had been found by a stranger, her body barely hanging on, and taken to the hospital where doctors, unable to identify her, gave her the name Maria. Her memory was gone, wiped clean by the trauma of being buried alive. Every day, Denise fought to piece together fragments of her past, but it never felt right. Something was missing, something vital. It wasn't until one ordinary day at the grocery store that everything came flooding back. As she bagged oranges, a voice reached her ears, one that she knew too well. Chuck's voice. It was his tone, the way he spoke, that sent a wave of recognition through her. Memories crashed into her mind. The heated argument, the gunshots, the suffocating feeling of dirt pressing down on her as she fought to stay alive. She remembered the grave. She remembered everything. Denise wasn't Maria. She was Denise Garrison, and Chuck Garrison had tried to kill her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her heart raced as the pieces of her shattered life snapped back into place. She had survived, but now it was time to seek justice. Denise knew she couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't let Chuck continue his life, free from the consequences of his actions. With her memories restored, she made the decision to confront him. She booked a flight to Atlanta, her mind set on one goal: to make Chuck pay for what he had done. The man who had buried her alive, convinced she was dead, had moved on. He had remarried, continued with his business, and lived as if nothing had happened. But Denise was alive, and she was coming for him. Chuck thought he had gotten away with murder, but Denise was determined to show him that the truth always comes to light, no matter how deep it's buried. Denise arrived at Chuck's home, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in 8 years, she stood on the very porch where he had once turned her life upside down. The house, once a symbol of their shared future, now felt like a haunting reminder of the dark chapter she had left behind. As she stood there, she could almost feel the weight of everything that had transpired. Her betrayal, the cold night she had been buried alive, and the man who had done it all. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it to knock on the door. The knock was deliberate, slow, and precise. It wasn't a knock to demand answers immediately, but a knock that signaled the beginning of her reckoning with Chuck. The seconds felt like hours as she waited. When Chuck opened the door, his eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. Standing before him was Denise, alive, breathing, and staring back at him without an ounce of fear. Chuck's face drained of color. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. He had buried her. He had watched the dirt cover her body, convinced that she was gone. He had moved on with his life, remarried, and buried the past. But now, standing in front of him was Denise, standing tall, strong, and very much alive. His heart sank. He had gotten away with it in his mind, but the truth had come knocking, and there was no escaping it. Denise stepped forward with a calmness that unsettled Chuck. There was no anger in her eyes, no scream to tear him down. She wasn't here to shout or curse at him. She was here for one simple reason: to make Chuck face the truth he had spent 8 years running from. "Why did you do it, Chuck?" she asked, her voice steady, yet filled with a quiet strength. Chuck's hands began to tremble, his body betraying the cold exterior he had so carefully cultivated. He tried to rationalize, to deny the reality that was standing in front of him. "You left me, Denise," Chuck stammered. His voice cracked under the weight of his own lies. "You left me with nothing. You were going to take everything. I had no choice." Denise's expression remained unchanged. She had heard it all before. The same excuses, the same manipulation. This time, it wasn't going to work. "No, Chuck," she replied calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You tried to kill me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping it anymore. Denise knew what had happened. She had survived, and she was standing in front of him, unbroken. The facade of innocence he had so carefully constructed over the years began to crumble before his eyes. Chuck's face twisted with panic. He fumbled for words, anything to get out of this moment. But it was too late. Denise wasn't the same woman he had buried in Cancun all those years ago. The woman standing in front of him was strong, resilient, and unafraid. The power had shifted, and Chuck knew it. Denise took a deep breath and reached into her purse. The cold weight of her phone in her hand was the only thing that kept her grounded. She dialed the police number with an eerie calmness, her voice steady as she spoke into the phone. "This is Denise Garrison," she said. "I'm at my husband's house, and I need to report an attempted murder." As the words left her mouth, Chuck's entire world began to unravel. The sirens in the distance grew louder, a sound that signified the end of his carefully constructed life. The life he had built on lies, manipulation, and murder was crumbling around him. When the police arrived, Chuck tried to protest, but the evidence was undeniable. The investigators uncovered the truth about his financial troubles, his motive for murder, and the fact that Denise had survived. The shallow grave he had thought would bury his past only led to his downfall. Chuck was arrested that night. His freedom ripped away in an instant. His life, built on deceit and violence, had crumbled, and the consequences of his actions were finally catching up with him. Denise had finally gotten the justice she deserved, but the emotional scars remained. She had survived a brutal attempt on her life, clawed her way out of a shallow grave, and confronted the man who had tried to erase her. But the pain of betrayal, the weight of her trauma, was something that would stay with her forever. In the end, Chuck was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But Denise knew that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming her life, her voice, and her truth. The past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to resurface. The truth had come to light, and Denise had faced her demons head-on. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how hard one tries to bury the past, the truth always finds a way to rise to the surface. And when it does, there is no escaping it.